Guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast for today. Today we are continuing our exploration of key concept 2.1, the codification of cultural traditions. In today's lesson, though, we are focusing on the classical religions of South Asia. And again, we're going regionally in our lessons as opposed to chronologically. The two symbols that you see on your screen right now on the left is the symbol for this word Om, which some Hindus believe is the word that brought the universe into being. It's a very sacred image and sound as far as many of them are concerned. On the right is the Buddhist wheel of life. And there's a whole lot going on in that image that we will explain as we will proceed. The idea, though, is diversity and unity here, because one of the things that we have to keep in mind, India is one of the most culturally diverse places in the world. The number of languages, the number of ethnic groups, it's way more diverse than many of us assume. But our story begins with the Aryans, the Indo-Europeans that moved into the area between the Indus River and the Ganges River. These were descendants, of course, of the same people that will end up becoming Persians. They bring with them a polytheistic mythology. They bring with them a focus on the horse, domesticated animals. Remember that the Indus Valley civilization existed before the Aryans got there, and we're not really sure what happened to them. Many of them probably blended in with the Aryans when they get there, but when the Aryans get there, they bring with them certain stories, and most of those are collected in a series of sacred scriptures called the Vedas that are believed to be directly from the gods. The most important of these is a book called the Rig Veda that includes a bunch of hymns and chants that go back thousands and thousands of years that were passed on orally. They had to be memorized, and in fact, as we'll see, the priest didn't want them to be written down for a very, very long time. So they weren't written down until much later. They're really focused on particular rituals. Horse sacrifice is a really big one. Again, not surprising given the background of the Aryans. This is one of the earliest recordings in the script Devanagari, but remember, it's not written down until much, much later. It exists for thousands of years before it's ever written down. However, you will notice that we use the word Hinduisms plural because there's so many different ways to practice being a Hindu. It's very different than other religions. That's reflected in their sacred scriptures because there's another series of texts called the Upanishads, which originally started off as commentaries on the Vedas, but then some Hindus believe that they are in fact divinely inspired. They're a lot more philosophical, though, kind of abstract. And then there's also a bunch of texts that are epic stories, poems that certain Hindus believe came directly from the gods. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana are two of those. In the Mahabharata, there's a section in there where a god we'll talk about in just a moment explains the whole concept of Dharma, of sacred duty. And some Hindus believe that part of the bigger book is also a sacred scripture. So again, what we're seeing already is this notion that there's all sorts of different ways to believe and practice, but still be considered a Hindu, which is why we use the word Hinduisms. In terms of the gods, though, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of different gods in Hinduism. Some of them were brought by the Aryans, some of them we suspect existed from the Indus Valley and got mixed into their pantheon. This is Ganesha, my favorite of the Hindu gods. I'll maybe tell you about that later on. But over time, some Hindus start to believe in something called the Trimurti. Now, that's a Sanskrit word, but if you look at it, you immediately recognize tri, meaning three. Again, this is one of the clues that maybe the people, the ancestors of the Aryans and the Persians and the Romans and the Greeks might have had a common source. The Trimurti are the idea that there's three main gods. And again, this is what some Hindus believe. of those three main gods is Brahma, the creator god, Shiva, the destroyer god, and you need creation and destruction. They feed off of each other, as we'll see in just a moment. But then the third god is Vishnu, who is the balancer. Like Vishnu's role for those who believe in the Trimurti as the three main gods, um, his job is to keep that balance between creation and destruction. And you'll notice in this image, he's got a whole lot of faces because many Hindus believe that Vishnu made himself appear on this earth whenever that balance was getting out of whack to bring everything into balance for the good of this realm on this earth. That is something called an avatar. Now, I need to understand something. Gods have the ability, according to this belief, to make themselves be born in human form or animal form for that matter. They can choose that. The rest of us cannot, and I'll explain more in a moment. These are incarnations as opposed to reincarnations. They choose that. In the Mahabharata, Vishnu chooses to be born as a guy named Krishna, and his job is to convince a warrior Arjuna that his dharma, his sacred duty, is to kill his half brother whom he loves, but he needs to do it because the fate of humanity rests in it. In the story of the Ramayana, Rama, the main hero, who also has to do his sacred duty, even though he doesn't want to. In his case, he has to leave his home and his kingdom, and eventually he has to separate from his wife. That too is an incarnation of Vishnu, who has to do this to restore balance for the good of all humanity. Some Hindus believe that the Buddha, whom we'll talk about in just a moment, was actually just an incarnation of Vishnu, who came down to restore balance in the world. Now, in terms of the core beliefs, there's 6 concepts that are really tricky, and this is really what I want to focus on. So let's try to come to like what these terms mean first and see how they all work together. First are the terms Brahman and Atman. Brahman is usually translated as ultimate reality. For some Hindus, it's understood to be a non-personal God. It's not God in the way that many people in the West would assume a personal God, but this abstract universal flow that exists. But then there's Atman, which is frequently translated as soul, but as we'll see, like it's not your individual soul. There's a piece of you that exists throughout all time and space. That's the Atman. So those are our basic definitions. We'll come back to how this all works here in just a second. But the second pair of concepts are samsara and moksha. Samsara is what we typically mean when we say reincarnation. It's not precise, but it's close enough. Moksha, which literally means liberation, is freeing your soul from the cycle of reincarnation. Here is an image to try to explain how this works. So, samsara is this circle of birth, life, death, and then rebirth in another form. And the thing that is sort of recycled is your Atman. Now, it happens over literally thousands of years. And you are not consciously aware. Like individual soul does, like we think of individual, it means my consciousness, but that's not really what they're talking about. Now, your goal, and we'll talk about how you get there, is to escape this circle through moksha. Moksha is escaping that circle, and when that happens, your Atman is reunited with Brahman, with the universal ultimate reality. That's what the goal of Hinduism is. How do you do that? Well, that requires 2 more concepts, dharma and karma. Dharma generally is translated as sacred duty. This is what you must do in your lifetime. But here's the thing about dharma. It's not about a job or a task, okay? It literally, your Atman, your eternal soul is at stake if you don't do your sacred duty. Why? Well, because karma is what happens to your Atman in the next life. Okay? So if you put it all together, this phrase, which is really important you understand, do your Dharma, get good karma. Let's look at how these core beliefs all work together here. If you do your Dharma, your sacred duty, according to your caste or your role, if you do that in this life, your Atman will be reborn in the next life in a higher level. And if you do your Dharma there, you will be reborn after that and reborn after that. And over hundreds of generations, if you're lucky, your karma will get better each time, and then you will achieve moksha, and your Atman is reunited with Brahman. Again, these are really, sort of hard concepts to get around because they're so different from what many of us believe, but they are essential to understanding what's going on in South Asia because of the caste system. Clearly, the main impact that these beliefs have is on the social hierarchy. There's two aspects to caste, though. The first of these is Varna, and Varna is like the universal caste, and that comes from this story about the very first human, Purusa or Purusha, who his story is told in the Rig Veda. It's a very, very old story. He was the first human, but there were no other humans. And so the gods decided to create humans out of the body of Purusa. And the caste that you end up in, the Varna that you end up in, is dependent on which part of Purusa's body you came from. That in turn creates this social hierarchy that the laws of Manu set up the rules for. So here's how this works. At the top are the priests, the Brahmins, who come from the mouth of Purusa. The Kshatriya, who are the warriors, but also the kings come from the warrior caste. They are the arms. The Vaishya, the merchants, the landowners, the money makers, if you will, come from the legs. The Sudra, the servants, from the feet. Now, a couple of things about this. The first three castes, first three Varnas, excuse me, are known as twice-born because you are required to do a ritual initiation. When you go from being a boy to becoming a man, you're twice born. You're reborn as a man. That requires that you have to pay a Brahmin, though, to do that ritual. The Sudra, they do not have that. They are not twice born, okay? But then below them, you have the untouchables, the outcasts. These are the people that the Aryans believed they didn't even come from the body of Purusa. Like from the Aryan perspective, we're not even really sure they're humans. They do the absolute worst jobs. They're the ones that take care of dead bodies. They're the poop scoopers. They do the worst jobs imaginable. Okay. Now, something I want you to think about here. First of all, let's say if you're a servant, why would you continue to do your duty even though you're getting the worst job, or even worse than that, the untouchable, let's say? Well, the reason is because your Dharma. Like if you don't, you will get bad karma, and your next reincarnation, your next rebirth will actually go down the scale. In other words, you've jeopardized your Atman and made it harder to get moksha. And again, this is a hard concept for us to grasp, but this is what is holding their social order together. These three words are easily confused, but notice they all have a similar root. Brahma, the god of creation, Brahman, the ultimate reality, and Brahman, the priest. Don't confuse these three because they are so similar. Now, Varna is the main aspect of what we call caste, but there's another aspect called Jati. Jati is local. That is to say, it changes from region to region. It is not universal, and specifically, it's tied to a profession or a job. And so let me give you an example. In certain places in South Asia, people with the last name Patel are doctors. But in other regions of South Asia, people with the name Patel are merchants. Okay, so they're still in the same Varna, but their Jati is different in different parts of South Asia. But the thing about it is, you don't get to choose your profession or your job. Like, there is no choice. Like, you have to do that. That's your sacred duty. If you're a carpenter, your father's a carpenter, that's your name, that's your Jati, you will be a carpenter. But it gets more complicated than that because it also involves a set of rules, just like Varna, like who you can associate. The daughter of a carpenter has to marry another carpenter. Like, you cannot socialize outside of your Jati. It's a very complicated system, but again, that is another aspect of caste. But in terms of social impact, sati might be the most striking. There are two examples you're going to learn about this year of the most extreme forms of patriarchy, and this is one of them. Here's the idea. Like, when we look at the Varnas and the Jati, where do women fit in there? Well, the answer is women fit in with their man, their husband typically. Okay? Their dharma is to serve their husband and their sons from their belief. Okay? Women are literally attached to the men. So here, this raises the question: what happens then when a woman's husband dies? If her dharma is to serve her husband, well, the practice of sati literally means she has to kill herself. Now, in Hinduism, they don't bury the dead body because the body doesn't matter. It's the Atman that's going to be recreated. They cremate the body, they burn it on a funeral pyre. In the practice of sati, when a woman's husband dies and they burn his body, she is expected to throw herself on the fire, burn herself alive, so that her ashes are mixed with her husband's ashes. Now, again, we might look at that and go, that is absolutely preposterous. And in fact, many people, as we'll see, have tried to stop this practice and not very successfully. Why? Well, because of the concept of dharma. Like, it's not just like, oh, I have to do this. It's literally, if you believe this, it is putting your eternal soul at risk if you don't. Very unusual practice there. Another unusual thing, though, about Hinduism, as an ethnic religion, it nonetheless spreads. And it does this primarily through migration. Trade routes send merchants throughout Southeast Asia, and many of them end up living there. Then people from other castes start moving there, and over time, they set up a kind of Hindu system within Southeast Asia. And again, that's kind of unusual because it's not a universal religion. Like, you can't convert to Hinduism, and yet this religion spreads. This is a pretty unusual case here. This takes us up to Buddhism then. All right, and there is a historical founder, Siddhartha Gautama. Now, he was a historical figure, and this is his name, okay? He was born a Kshatriya, he was a Hindu, he was a prince. His father was a king, and he was going to be the king of that city someday. But then, uh, before he's born, his father is given a prophecy that someday his son is going to, like, totally walk away from the kingdom. And the father doesn't want that. So when Siddhartha is born, he totally protects him. He's not allowed to leave the city. He's not exposed to anything that's bad. He's like in this beautiful prison, so to speak. but he is treated exceedingly well. Nonetheless, he wants to know what's outside the city. So he gets his teacher to help him escape the city, and he goes on an adventure to see what is happening outside the city. Along the way, he sees an old man, a really old man, and he's never seen an old man because his father's shielding him from everything. He asks his teacher, "What is that?" And he says, "Well, that's old age. Everybody gets old." And Siddhartha's like, "Well, that sucks. I don't want to do that." And they move along, and then they see a sick man. And he says, "Well, what is that?" And he goes, "Well, that's illness. Like, illness is a part of life. Like, it happens to almost everybody." And Siddhartha's like, "Well, that sucks. I don't want to do that at all." And he continues on, and he sees a corpse, a dead body. And he's like, "What is that?" And the teacher says, "Well, that's death. Everybody dies. Like, that's a part of life." And Siddhartha's like, "Well, that's stupid. I don't want to do that." Well, when he gets back to his city, he is so distraught by all of this that he's like, "This is crazy. All I see is suffering. My father hid all this from me. How do I end suffering?" Well, his answer to that is he leaves the city, he leaves behind his whole beautiful life that he had to become an ascetic. An ascetic is a holy man living in the wilderness. They fast, they pray, they meditate. Some Hindus believe that they're like on the final stage before moksha, but they have to do yoga and all of these things to get there. He wants to understand how to end suffering. Now, here's the thing. Much like Jesus, he did not set out to have a new religion. He was a Hindu. What he wanted to do, first of all, he did not promote any specific deities. In fact, of all, there's thousands of gods in Hinduism, he doesn't mention any of them once. It's not what he's concerned about because he is exclusively focused on how to end suffering. Now, according to the story, he goes to all of these holy men and practices all of these things. He starves himself almost to death, but he can't find it. So he goes to sit under a Bodhi tree and he meditates for days and days. And there's all sorts of great stories I could tell you about that. But at one point, he becomes enlightened. He realizes how to end suffering. At that point, believers call him Buddha. Buddha means the enlightened one. It's a title. Okay, his name is not Buddha, it's a title. Buddhists call him the Buddha. Why? Because he's enlightened. He knows how to end suffering. Now, those teachings are codified in sacred scriptures. Rather like Hinduisms, there's a bunch of different varieties. Pali was the language that Siddhartha spoke. It's related to Sanskrit, and there are 3 books that were written by his students in the language that the Buddha spoke. The Tripitaka, 3 again, okay? Now, the one that you need to know is called the Dhammapada. This is really the only text you must know. Dhamma in Pali is a version of Dharma in Sanskrit. It literally, it's usually translated as like at the foot of the teachings, again, written by his students. There's other traditions, though, that different types of Buddhists will come to in just a second believe are also sacred scriptures. But again, the one that you really need to know, the Dhammapada, which is one of the 3 books that were written by the students of the Buddha during his lifetime. We'll come back to that in just a moment. So what are the core beliefs then? What is he teaching in the Dhammapada? Well, the thing that you need to know is what's known as the 4 noble truths. First truth, life is suffering. All life is suffering. Like, that's the revelation he has when he goes on his journey. Suffering, he says, is caused by desire, not physical desire so much, but suffering is caused because you want something that is not actually there. Okay? So think about it this way. If you've ever lost somebody you love, and I'm sorry to say, if you haven't, you will. That's part of life. But why do we feel so bad when somebody we love dies? It's because we want to be with them and we can't, right? It's desire. We don't maybe think of it that way, but it kind of makes sense. He says all suffering is caused by desire. You want something that is not there. Well, if you eliminate desire, then you end suffering. And if you end suffering, you reach a place called nirvana. Now, nirvana is an interesting concept. It's very much like moksha, but there's a fundamental difference because number one, nirvana, you have the ability to achieve in this lifetime. You don't have to wait hundreds of lifetimes hoping to get good karma and come back and keep moving up the ladder. You can achieve nirvana right now and you will have this enlightened state. That's a pretty radical teaching. How do you get to nirvana, though? Well, the way you do that is what he calls the eightfold path. Now, you need to remember the eightfold path, but you do not need, I promise you, you do not need to know what the 8 things are. I do want you to take a look at them, though, because he's saying you have to do these 8 things in order to achieve nirvana. One of them I want to point out is right livelihood, because you might remember Ashoka, who was the emperor who feels horrible about all the people that he's killed. He's a conqueror. That's his job. His job as an emperor is to go conquer people. But he feels bad about it, and he's caught in this dilemma because his livelihood, his job is he's got to go conquer people. But yet once he converts, he's a Buddhist. He wants to end suffering. Like that's a kind of intractable problem that he's dealing with there. Okay, so let me come back to the wheel of life here. Check this out. In the center of the wheel, you see what kind of looks like the yin-yang symbol, except for it's 3, the Tripitaka, the 3 teachings, the original teachings, in which he says all life is suffering. Suffering is caused by desire, and desire to get to nirvana. How? 8-fold path. There are 8 spokes on the wheel, and the wheel is the wheel of life. The cycle, in Hinduism called samsara, and he knows a way out. Like that's his big teaching. He knows a way out of suffering. That has a huge social impact in South Asia. First of all, he's saying you don't need all those elaborate rituals. Like Hindus have to pay Brahmins to do all of these rituals for them. So the Brahmins are not at all happy with this teaching of the Buddha, the enlightened one. Moreover, he says all of the caste system is irrelevant. Varna and Jati is irrelevant because you can achieve nirvana in this lifetime, right? So now, again, those who are at the top of the Varna are not happy with that. But consider the people who are at the lower levels of the Varna. They find that quite attractive. In another similarity to Christianity, early Buddhism develops a tradition of monasticism, where you can withdraw from the world and focus on your spirituality, and that's seen as a good thing. In Pali, the word for monk, there is no female equivalent. Like we have the word nun. All people can do this. And again, that may not seem like a big deal for us, but that's a really serious threat to patriarchy. In particular, if you consider in South Asia, think about the idea of sati. Like if you are practicing a version of Hinduism and you're a woman and your husband dies, you have to throw yourself on the funeral pyre. On the other hand, if you're a Buddhist, you could become a nun and focus on your spiritual life, and that's a totally acceptable alternative. Now, in terms of the expansion of Buddhism and its influence, Ashoka's conversion is obviously a pretty big, deal. But you'll remember he, like through his pillar edicts, He wants to promote spirituality among his people, whatever form of spirituality that might be. However, he does send missionaries out into other parts of Asia to promote Buddhism. The earliest spread is the version that goes into Southeast Asia. This is known as Theravada Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism basically says the Buddha was a teacher. And the Buddha never claimed to be a god. He just knows the way to end suffering. That's the variation that spreads through trade and missionaries into Southeast Asia. But another version develops in Central Asia, China, and Korea, and Japan called Mahayana. And in Mahayana Buddhism, the Buddha is worshipped as a god. This is a development that happens over time. And there's a whole lot more to the difference between the two. We'll definitely get into in the next time. But the process that's happening as it spreads into Central Asia and then East Asia is a process known as syncretism. Now, we will go way more in detail about syncretism in the next unit in the post-classical period. But the basic idea here is that you can think of it as a kind of blending of traditions. It's a little more complicated than that. But in the case of Buddhism, syncretism occurs with these figures known as bodhisattvas. Now, a bodhisattva, if you are a Mahayana Buddhist, is somebody who has achieved nirvana, but rather than like just disappearing into the, whatever realm the spiritual world is, a bodhisattva chooses to stay in this realm to help other people. Okay? And what's happening here is as Buddhism is spreading, Mahayana Buddhism, I should say, worshiping Buddha as a god, the local gods are not seen as gods, they're seen as bodhisattvas. They're like the missionaries trying to spread Buddhism. They're like, oh no, you could still have your little god there, but what you need to realize is he's just a guy who found enlightenment and a way to end suffering, and then he stayed on this earth just to help you. So you could still worship him, that's fine, but he's really just a bodhisattva. If you've ever been to a Chinese restaurant and you've seen an image of the fat guy and you're supposed to like rub his belly for good luck and people say that's the Buddha, that's actually a bodhisattva. That is a Chinese god of happiness that existed way before Buddhism showed up, and the missionaries, not mercenaries, simply they were like, oh yeah, well that guy, he's just a bodhisattva. He's just a guy who got enlightenment, but you can still rub his belly for good luck. Nothing wrong with that. Now, we'll get into this difference much more about Theravada and Mahayana in the process of syncretism later on. But what I want to note finally is it's interesting that Buddhism started off in South Asia, but it doesn't remain there. It spreads into East and Southeast Asia. And for the rest of our course through world history, that's its primary focus, even though it started in South Asia. One of the explanations for this, though, has to do with the nature of Hinduism itself, Hinduisms. Because many people practicing a variation of Hinduism just say, well, that teacher that you call the Buddha, well, he was just an incarnation of Vishnu. And he came down to try to create balance between creation and destruction. There's several other traditions we'll talk more of. This has been a particularly long video, but it's because the concepts involved are really, for most of us in the West, very different and hard to get our minds around. I apologize for taking so long today. The focus question, there's something in particular I'm going to have you do. I'll explain that in class, but I want to thank you for your attention and have a great rest of the day.